Since April 2023, there has been a civil war in Sudan. It is said that war never ends, but rather moves from place to place. That might be true for most of the world, where there are relatively long periods of peace with periods of conflict interspersed between. But Sudan's case is rather peculiar. I think that war has never ended in Sudan, and neither has it left the country to go to any other place. I think that Sudan has always suffered war, with peace being the interrupter and not the other way around. Sudan gained independence on January 1, 1956, from the joint administration of Great Britain and Egypt, known as the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium. 4 months before the country saw the light of day, it was at war, a war that would last 17 years and end in 1972. That a nation would descend into civil war before it was born should have been an omen to the sort of history it was going to make, but none of us are soothsayers. I say that Sudan has always been at war with transitional periods of peace because the Second Sudanese Civil War started in 1983 and ended in 2005. For 22 years, this war was fought between the central government and the Sudan People's Liberation Army, SPLA. This war resulted in the independence of South Sudan in 2011, and I know you think the period between 2005 and 2011 was an interruptive peace period, but it wasn't. Permit me to surprise you by saying that Sudan was running 2 concurrent conflicts. For as the country was in the middle of the Second Civil War, it was also dealing with the Lord's Resistance Army insurgency in the southern regions of Sudan, where a group of rebel Ugandan troops were operating, causing chaos and instability. But I'm trying to explain Sudan's convoluted security situation as best as I can, without overloading you with information. For a brief period between 2003 and 2005, it could be said that Sudan was engaged in 3 concurrent conflicts, because the war in Darfur started in 2003 and carried on until 2020. It was a major conflict between the Sudanese government and allied Janjaweed militias against rebel groups like the Sudan Liberation Movement and Justice and Equality Movement. Sudan was also engaged in the Chad-Sudan conflict, a proxy war that began when the Darfur crisis spilled into Chad. This one began in 2005 and went on till 2010. There was also the Sudan-South Sudan War in 2012 and numerous internal armed conflicts between rival militias and anti-government factions between 2011 and 2020. With this, I hope I have established enough context for you to understand that I am not engaging in hate speech when I say that Sudan has sadly never known peace since its inception. I have nothing against the country and I wish for world peace, but it is difficult to describe Sudan's plight without sounding hateful. Since April 2023, there has been a war in Sudan, and its seeds were sown on April 11, 2019 by the overthrow of the long-time president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir. Omar al-Bashir came to power in June 30, 1989, by leading a bloodless military coup that overthrew the democratically elected government of Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi. At the time, Bashir was a colonel in the Sudanese army. The coup was masterminded and heavily backed by veteran Islamist politician Hassan al-Turabi and his National Islamic Front (NIF). Following the coup d'etat, Bashir was appointed chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council for National Salvation (RCC), which acted as the new governing authority. He dissolved the parliament, banned all political parties, and suspended the constitution. The RCC was later disbanded in 1993, at which point Bashir officially transitioned from the head of the military council to the president of Sudan. Omar al-Bashir was a harsh ruler. During his time in power, he was accused of war crimes during the Darfur conflict, which began in 2003 when rebels took up arms at alleged government discrimination. Hundreds of thousands were killed in the crisis. The International Criminal Court, ICC, indicted Mr. Bashir on charges of crimes against humanity and genocide, although the investigation was eventually suspended due to a lack of UN support. However, Mr. Bashir went on to win his first term as an elected president in polls in 2010 in an election which was widely regarded as fraudulent. In 2011, South Sudan seceded from the nation and took 75% of Sudan's oil reserves with them. This plunged the country into economic chaos, leading Bashir to declare a list of austerity measures aimed at stemming the economic blood loss caused by a loss of oil revenue. These measures made the basic prices of goods to skyrocket, and inflation went as high as 70% in 2018. The people began to protest, and al-Bashir did what a dictator knows how to do best. He forcefully dispersed the crowds and arrested opposition party leaders, but he didn't stop there. To reduce the strain on the economy, he did something that really inflamed the people. He cut fuel and bread subsidies. The people began to clamor for Bashir to step down, and protests rocked the capital city of Khartoum. Bashir declared a national state of emergency, removing all state governors and replacing them with members of his security forces. By then, more than a few top military and police officers were done with his nonsense, so they ordered their troops to stand down and not make any arrests, some even going as far as intervening to protect protesters from security forces. The situation gradually escalated until the military had enough, finally ousting and arresting Omar al-Bashir on the 11th of April 2019. General Ahmed Awad ibn Auf, then defense minister, announced the coup on state television and quickly stepped down. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan then took over as the head of the Transitional Military Council. The Transitional Military Council handed over power to a joint military/civilian government. This government was overthrown in another coup in 2021. The result of this coup was a government led by two generals. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the commander-in-chief of the Sudanese armed forces and effectively the country's president, and his vice, General Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, commander of the Rapid Support Forces, known by his nom de guerre as Hemedti. The Rapid Support Forces are a powerful paramilitary force formerly operated by the Sudanese government. They originated from the Janjaweed fighters who fought for the Sudanese government in the war in Darfur as auxiliary units. In 2013, al-Bashir reformed and reorganized the force as a legitimate paramilitary organization and placed it under the command of Hemedti. The RSF has a bloody reputation, having perpetrated mass killings, mass rapes, pillage, torture, and destruction of villages. They were accused of committing ethnic cleansing against the Fur, Masalit, and Zagawa peoples, all of these dark-skinned and non-Arab ethnicities of Sudan. Leaders of the RSF have been indicted for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Court, but Hemedti was not personally implicated in the 2003 to 2004 atrocities. By 2023, the two generals Burhan and Hemedti had become so influential, with each controlling vast swathes of territory, including gold mines and arable farmland. They naturally disagreed on the proposed move towards civilian rule, neither wanting to give up power to the other. The RSF had grown into a 100,000-strong formidable army, and there were talks about incorporating it into the Sudanese military. Hemedti and Burhan knew that they both couldn't control this new amalgamated army at the same time. Tensions were worsened by Burhan's sudden restoration of the old officials who dominated Omar al-Bashir's government. Hemedti saw the appointment of these officials as a signal that Burhan was attempting to maintain the dominance of Khartoum's traditional elite over Sudanese politics. This was a danger to the RSF's political position, as said elites were hostile to Hemedti due to his ethnic background as a Darfuri Arab. Hemedti began to voice out his regrets for the involvement in the 2021 coup. Due to the rising tensions, both generals began an arms race, and the RSF quickly began recruiting across Sudan and consolidating their forces in Khartoum until a deal was struck and they withdrew. Hemedti wanted a 10-year timetable for the integration of the RSF into the Sudanese army, but Burhan was not giving him more than 2 years. Hemedti also wanted the integrated RSF troops to be under the command of their own army chief rather than under Sudan's commander-in-chief al-Burhan. It was suspected that Hemedti's proposed army chief was none other than himself. Burhan was having none of that. On the 11th of April 2023, RSF forces deployed near the city of Merowe as well as in Khartoum. Government forces ordered them to leave and were refused. This led to clashes when RSF forces took control of the Soba military base south of Khartoum. On April 13, RSF forces began their mobilization, raising fears of a potential rebellion against the junta. The SAF declared the mobilization as illegal. On the 15th of April 2023, Hemedti's troops struck, attacking SAF forces across Sudan, particularly in Khartoum and its airport. The Battle of Khartoum was underway, with RSF fighters quickly capturing key bridges and roads and taking control of the state broadcasting service Sudan TV after a brief struggle. The next day, SAF troops mounted a stiff counter-offensive and retook the Sudan TV headquarters and state radio. Sudan was at war again. Telecom provider MTN shut down operations. The Aviation Authority closed Sudan's airspace, and Maersk, one of the world's largest shipping companies, announced a pause on new shipments to the country. In less than a week, there was near total internet outrage, worsened by the damage suffered by the electricity grid. Sudanese international trade was near non-existent. Because of the rapidity of the onset of the war, General Burhan was caught off guard and he was unable to evacuate from Khartoum. Hemedti ordered his troops to capture or kill Burhan, who managed to evade death or capture and retreated into the SAF base in Khartoum. The base was then placed under unrelenting siege and gruesome combats took place in the area. Hemedti, in a press conference, accused Burhan of trying to bring the deposed al-Bashir back into power, claimed that the SAF was filled with radical Islamic militants, and called on the international community to intervene against his adversary. May came around and the SAF rolled into Khartoum with airstrikes and artillery fire. They only managed to destroy the city's infrastructure, ultimately failing to dislodge RSF fighters from their positions. Burhan continued receiving death threats from his besieged army headquarters in Khartoum, so he sent out a message vowing to continue fighting. He officially removed Hemedti as his deputy, replacing him with a former rebel leader named Malik Agar. With Burhan under siege, Agar became the de facto leader of the Sudanese government, for which there was little space in Khartoum, as the RSF occupied large swathes of the city. The Sudanese government eventually relocated to the city of Port Sudan on the Red Sea, making it the capital in effect. The international community eventually had its attention drawn to the war due to the high number of civilian casualties involved. The United Nations Human Rights Council called delegates from the RSF and SAF to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, to discuss terms. There, both parties agreed to ensure safe passage of civilians, protect relief workers, and prohibit the use of human shields. There was no wish whatsoever for a ceasefire, and there was frustration over the lack of commitment by both sides to stop the fighting. It continued with scores of civilian casualties being recorded. Most of these civilian deaths were blamed on RSF militias. From June until October of 2023, the battle for control of Khartoum continued. A force of SAF troops was put together to lift the siege of the army headquarters and free Burhan, who was still trapped there. The column was ambushed and destroyed, with the RSF claiming that it killed hundreds of enemy soldiers. In retaliation, the SAF increased their frequency of airstrikes and artillery bombardment, and as many as a dozen civilians were getting killed per strike. The RSF also tried to match them shell for shell, airstrike for airstrike, with Sudanese civilians paying the price with their lives as usual. Heavy fighting continued until August, with Burhan eventually getting freed on the 24th and flown to Port Sudan. Burhan started a world tour of some sorts. He traveled to numerous countries, meeting with presidents and trying to rally support for his cause. He eventually attended the 78th United Nations General Assembly at the head of the Sudanese delegation, where he urged the world to label the RSF a terrorist organization. Fighting continued in Darfur. It was particularly bad in Jenaina. Hundreds of civilians were killed, and the RSF allegedly engaged in acts of genocide against the Masalit population of the region. Mass graves were discovered, and the governor of West Darfur, who accused the RSF of committing acts of genocide and ethnic cleansing in his state, was abducted and executed. The SAF weren't doing much better. They continued carrying out indiscriminate airstrikes against the RSF, not minding the exorbitant cost in the lives of civilians. Tribal leaders began declaring allegiance for one side or the other, and the end of 2023 saw the SAF about to collapse in the Darfur region. The SAF garrison in Jenaina eventually surrendered, and it was rumored that as many as 2,000 civilians were massacred. More talks were held, but both sides ultimately failed to reach a ceasefire agreement. 2024 came around, and the economic costs of this war had already surpassed all the previous ones since Sudanese independence. The destruction of infrastructure in Khartoum and other urban areas was the major cause of this. Hemedti made his own tour of Africa as he tried to revive the public image that he'd lost when his troops engaged in large-scale looting after capturing the city of Wad Madani in late 2023. His troops were locked in the deadly stalemate against the SAF fighters who had been bombarding RSF positions to disrupt their supply lines. An estimated 8 million people were displaced from the Khartoum area, and the UN expressed fears of famine and starvation awaiting hundreds of thousands later in the year. The dire situation was made worse when the SAF even more aggressively pushed into Omdurman, north of Khartoum. Omdurman was never exactly a food basket, so one can imagine what it was like for them when more than half of the population was hit by famine. Not to talk of the harrowing accounts of sexual violence. The RSF and its allies employed the systematic and deliberate use of rape as a weapon of terror to demonize, humiliate and suppress non-Arab communities. More than 12 million girls are at risk with these assaults occurring at checkpoints or while women attempt to get food or fetch water. No age is too young for these beasts, for even children younger than 5 years old are violated. The states of Khartoum, Darfur and Gezira are the worst hit, and some sort of sex slavery occurs there. Girls are kidnapped and used for the gratification of soldiers, and ransoms are set as high as $10,000. The BBC interviewed a woman from northern Darfur, a woman that has chosen to remain anonymous. She recounts her blood-curdling experience at the hands of the RSF. They took us to an open area. The first man raped me twice, the second once, the third 4 times, and the fourth once. Apart from the rapes, they beat us with sticks and pointed guns on my head. Another girl who was 15 was raped by 3 men. We were raped throughout the night. Another survivor said, 2 of the women in our group were raped by RSF militia in front of us. It was 4 to 5 men doing it together. One girl was 22 years old and she died there. Every day, when people go to the market, there are 4 or 5 cases of rape. When we go to the farm, this happens. Men, they will cover their heads and they will rape women. There is no way to stop the rapes. The only way is to try and stay home. We were 3 people and also my aunt. And there were 3 soldiers. They took each of us to different places. All of us, my sister, they raped her and now she's pregnant. I feel a deep pain. If this does not make your blood boil, then I don't know what would. Rape in Sudan, ever so rampant and widespread, has become one key defining feature of the war. It is impossible to discuss the conflict without making such a highlight when South Darfur alone recorded more than 1,300 survivors. One of them was just a year old. This is just an infinitesimally small fraction of what happens to women in Sudan. The RSF has denied any involvement in the systematic rape of women and children, arguing that these incidents are isolated. But I ask, isn't systemic the right word to describe innumerable quote-unquote isolated incidents? I ask if it isn't a systemic problem if rape is perpetrated by men who come from a culture with deeply entrenched gender inequality that gives them the agency over women's bodies, an agency that quickly becomes impunity when you put guns in their hands. The war raged on throughout the year with no significant change. It was a game of whack-a-mole between the RSF and the SAF, with one side capturing a city and losing it the next day, hoisting flags of victory in one town and rapidly retreating in defeat in another. The RSF took Sinjar and lost Jebel Moya, and when they captured al-Bashir in October after a ruinous siege, they turned around and lost Sinjar to the SAF. In December of 2024, the European Union and America slapped massive sanctions on both parties for what they described as a tragic climax to a year of mass atrocities. But of course, the diplomats stuck to the strongly worded statements and condemnations from the other side of the world, and war continued in Sudan. The United States of America finally released a report calling out the RSF for their acts of genocide in Darfur, stating that after an 11-month blockade that deliberately starved the population, the RSF captured the North Darfur capital. Within the first 72 hours of the city's fall, fighters killed thousands of civilians in a coordinated slaughter. Widespread massacres also occurred across West Darfur, most notably in Jenaina and Adamata, featuring mass summary executions, the looting and burning of civilian shelters, and the targeted elimination of community leaders. The RSF and their allies have also carried out identity-based killings, deliberately separating and murdering men, boys, and non-Arab community members, while making explicit declarations about eliminating these groups from Darfur. Some people were buried alive. As usual, Hemedti received sanctions and a diplomatic slap on the face, but the killings continued. 2025 started with the SAF launching attacks on the capital city, Khartoum, which they eventually liberated in March. Fighting then shifted again to Darfur, and there the RSF was much more successful. In a massive turning point, the SAF took back the Presidential Palace, the Central Bank of Sudan, and Khartoum International Airport, allowing Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan to declare the capital free. Fighting heavily intensified in Darfur. The RSF bombed camps in al-Bashir and targeted healthcare facilities, leading to the closure of the MSF-supported South Hospital. They also made major strategic gains by seizing territory along Sudan's borders with Egypt and Libya. The UN Security Council was forced to task the Secretary General with reviewing civilian protection options amid the violence. Fighting continued even later on in August, when there was a cholera outbreak in the region. RSF forces made humanitarian efforts a dauntingly dangerous task by targeting aid convoys as if they weren't finding it difficult enough to reach the region due to closed roads. In September, mediation efforts stalled as both the SAF and RSF pushed for military victory. Violence escalated in rural areas of Kordofan, while malnutrition and disease fueled catastrophic civilian death rates. The RSF then captured the city of al-Bashir, solidifying control over the city. In December, they had taken control of virtually all of Darfur, reportedly killing countless civilians in a highly covered-up massacre. Both the SAF and RSF eyed further territorial gains. The RSF formed a rival government, fueling fears that Sudan could formally split. In December, the fighting escalated to involve heavy drone warfare, which hit the Heglig oil field, plunged regions into darkness, and resulted in deadly strikes on a UN base in Kadugli. In early January 2026, Sudan surpassed the 1,000-day mark of the conflict. Heavy drone strikes targeted areas like North and South Kordofan, worsening a dire humanitarian crisis that left over 21 million people facing acute food insecurity. UN human rights officials raised the alarm, warning that the violence was entering a deadlier phase. High-level reports indicated the RSF's actions displayed hallmarks of genocide, following the previous year's siege of al-Bashir. The Kordofan front intensified, with residential areas and hospitals struck by both sides. The UN reported that 80% of all conflict-related fatalities were due to drone strikes during the first quarter of the year. April 15 marked the start of the conflict's fourth year. It remains the world's largest internal displacement and hunger crisis, with an estimated 33.7 million people in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. The SAF and RSF actively adopted asymmetric resource denial strategies to destroy the adversary's logical capacity, further devastating civilian infrastructure. The conflict transitioned into entrenched campaigns for survival rather than outright territorial control. With the rainy season looming, aid agencies warned of deepening needs in neighboring countries accommodating over 4 million Sudanese refugees. The UN Security Council continued to monitor the crisis with monthly updates, including the focus on children in armed conflict. And so Sudan remains a generational battlefield, a place where war is punctuated by peace and peace remains an illusion. As of the time of writing, I see red ants fighting black ants in my back garden, and I wonder what makes us so different. It's always about resources, territory, control, and sometimes it's for less. Like red ants fighting black ants in my back garden.